Unless you've been living under a rock or otherwise possessed of only 2 brain cells, it is pretty obvious that by now the left has won the cultural battle and arguably to varying degrees the political battle. I don't really think this is up for debate. The real question is how we got here. And to steelman, if you want to call it steelman in a certain position, yes, there are some progressives that still claim everything is right-wing and it's too right-wing and the left is not dominant. But that is, and we'll talk about this later, encoded in the very nature of the left, which is to say, always pushing the boundaries and the borders. There's never enough. I made a video about this, of course. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Well, my phraseology is to give them an inch and they'll take leagues. And that's what they do. So the people that object to that idea, which I think is pretty well established, the left has won, they are inevitably progressives who want even more change because that's all they want. Change, 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 never enough. But the interesting thing here is not per se the left has won. It has won the cultural battle, the cultural war. But far more interesting is the question as to how and why, right? Because what we observe now is effectively a synthesis of things that have been ongoing for decades. Bit by bit, the right has conceded ground. But in this video, I want to pinpoint one particular area that the right has almost categorically failed on up until comparatively recently, and that is the area of media. Now, we tend to think of media these days as social media, online stuff, websites, YouTube. That's all true, but of course that stuff has not always been around. And prior to the emergence of these things, media could take many different forms. There was the press, obviously. There was television, there was radio. And the left has simply always been better at availing themselves of these mediums. Now, there's a distinction here to be made. The left hasn't always been great at creating these things. So if you look at modern Silicon Valley as an example, a lot of these guys who did some of this work and really put the internet on the map were libertarian types, that sort of thing. But what's much more important here is what the left tends to do with technology that already exists. They tend to use it for their own radical means. And one can famously refer to the mid-20th century radical who wrote the book Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky, always trying to push the boundaries. And the left realized that taking advantage of media is the best way to do that. Now, the question that emerges from this is why the right didn't do that. Well, of course the right did that too, in as much as books are a form of media. The people on the right wrote books, they had radio programs, they had television programs, and so on and so forth, but not to the same degree as the left, and they just weren't as vociferous. Furthermore, one essential divide between the left and the right is the simple fact that, as I pointed out many times, the left always wants to push boundaries and borders, and the right tends to recede into them. So inasmuch as the right has had a media presence throughout the many decades, it's always been there as a mild counterbalance, digging your feet in the ground, as it were, but rarely to actively push for things, because although I wouldn't claim conservatism is necessarily the only right-wing position, a lot of conservatism is right-wing positions. So the nature of the conservative is you conserve whatever's there or what was in the past, and oddly enough, what was most recent. So you're not going to necessarily push for certain things. Now, why has it all come to a head these days? Well, I think, and this is just my interpretation and opinion, but I think I can ground it and found it. I think that an emergent technology such as the internet allowed the left to capitalize on its innate tendency to push boundaries and borders and to be creative and manipulative with a new medium that had not existed. We see this in the gaming world in general, right? For whatever reason, and maybe some of these reasons are inscrutable, maybe we just don't know, on average, people who are creative, involved in the arts, game developers, this sort, on average, they tend to be left-leaning. So we already have a whole medium, for example, video games and other related media, that de facto, just looking at the overall population, is not going to have a lot of people on the right. And in as much as the right is all about digging their heels in and just not yielding ground, even though they've been yielding ground constantly for decades now, they wouldn't want to actively get involved in a gaming project. That's not universal, but on average, this is the case. Creative types that work in the arts, and yes, this does include certain types of game development, typically are on the left. And this is part and parcel of what the right has missed out on compared to the left. The left has always been much more proactive and much more, not necessarily tech savvy, because they typically don't create the technologies, but they're much more tech friendly in a way. They like to use the tech to achieve certain things. Which is not to say that the right doesn't use the tech to achieve certain things, but it's more about status quo. Oh, this is going to help us to do some basic thing. Whereas with the left, with a tendency to push boundaries, has done just that. So the cumulative effect of certain talking points and directions the left has been pushing for decades in the context of the United States, but also in Europe, I'd argue, is such that you end up with a current day situation or current year situation where social media is dominated by the left. And the other interesting thing you can observe in this whole process is it's not particularly covert anymore. When the left was an underdog, yes, they complained about lack of free speech and this and that. They were anti-war, they were this. Because they took up causes, I think, whether by intention or manipulation or a combination thereof, that seemed noble. There was a kind of nobility, for example, in protesting the Vietnam War, which was not universally but largely a left-wing position. All the other crazy stuff that they ultimately would push for, the very strange things that I don't need to name here, but you know what I'm talking about, that stuff they were probably on board with the whole time. They just didn't mention it because it wasn't very palatable for the public ear. And so along comes the digital age where, let's be honest, the left are the digital hegemons. Now, sure, the right exists in pockets and corners doing what they always do, digging their heels in and not doing much else. They become very open about how they see the world, what they want to do, the other quote-unquote progress they want to make. They make no secret of it anymore, now that they have achieved the position of digital hegemon. But for years, it was arguably a lot more covert, and they weren't as open about it. These other things crept in because what do you do when you have the power? You do what you want. And that's how we end up in this situation where left has won, the right has lost. Even though there are variations of right and left and whatever, broadly speaking, that's where we are. But a final point I want to bring home here is the failure of certain personalities and people who are nominally anti-establishment, some of them overtly right, some libertarian, some of them just not necessarily cool with the status quo, to create some kind of counter-platform in terms of digital media, in the sense that the Peter Thiels of the world, the Elon Musk, and Elon Musk, I don't know what his politics are exactly, we don't know, I guess he's sort of a moderate liberal, whatever, but the resources do exist amongst individuals if they wanted to do that, to create a platform or a series of platforms to erect the bulwark against the current tide. But I don't think they're really interested. I think these people, again, are so detached from the rest of humanity, they don't particularly care. They're not affected by this stuff. So the opportunity that the right had they come into cognizance of this issue, which, to be honest, they probably had already lost by then, but also the fact that the right's constantly hampered by its very nature, in the sense that they're not for pushing boundaries and borders, they're for preserving them. And so the failure of a lot of these people is in part due to that, but also they don't see the profit in it. And this is how we ended up in the current situation, ultimately. The left was always much better with media and always much more interested in using it to manipulate people. And I think that's really what accelerated the culture war and led to the ultimate victory of the left over the right. Anyway, gentlemen, please like and share if possible. Subscribe if you've not yet done so. Please hit the bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos. And as always, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. You take care. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.